Okay, hey everybody, it's Drew from 190 Methods. We're going to do our annual charts and graphs walkthrough. This year we've got 2 victories, 6 charts, 1 big map, and a whole lot of pictures to illustrate some of what we think are the defining trends of 2022 that will carry forward into 2023, and also some plans that help set up where we are, where we need to get on climate action, and how we're going to get there together, we think, through nonviolent civil disobedience, as well as digital supported tactics to help bring us there. So there's a longer version of this that'll be up in the blog with kind of written out and explaining more where the charts and graphs come from. But this is a quick walkthrough for people who want more visual information and want to just kind of get it at a glance. So here's what's in this year's report. Like I said, we'll start with what forces shaped 2022, and in particular, the themes we think will carry over to next year in 2023. And some of this is a little bit of a repeat of a post we put up earlier in the week, which recapped all of the many actions we took in 2022. So you'll hear some stuff, if you read through that longer blog post earlier in the week, you'll see some stuff repeated in there, kind of echoed. We'll also have some new data. As promised, there are lots of charts and graphs in this, as there always are, particularly in the second section where we'll illustrate where we're at right now in terms of the world's global carbon budget, how the US fits into that, and how some of the recent policies that have been adopted by the Biden administration, particularly big decisions over the summer on using the Defense Production Act to scale up heat pumps, solar energy, batteries, and other clean energy tools. And then later in the summer, early in the fall, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And then later in the fall, the defeat of Manchin's Dirty Deal, which was kind of an add-on or intended to be an add-on to the Inflation Reduction Act, which we were able to stop, and how all that kind of feeds into the projection for how our carbon emissions will grow or shrink or change over the next couple of years, domestically here in the US and around the world. And then finally, like I said, our plan for 2023, where we think we are going, and what we think we will be doing for the next 12 or 18 months as we sort of move forward, and how we do that. Okay, so let's dive right in. Forces that shaped 2022, like I said, is a little bit of a recap of our earlier post. But the first thing we'll say is that the war in Ukraine was a huge driver of news and global energy policy in 2022, and we think that will continue to be the case. The war isn't over, obviously, and you'll hear about the war in Ukraine and its impacts on fossil fuels and clean energy policy around the world and here in the US throughout this presentation as we talk through more of the year. But the biggest thing to say about it is really what happened is in February, Russia invaded Ukraine and sort of unprovoked declaration of war on the people there. And very much bound up in it is the question of fossil fuels and governments and parties. We call them fossil fuel fascists, autocratic regions, countries, governors, states here in the US, other politicians and people who are primarily financed by the fossil fuel industry, depend on fossil fuels to make money, and therefore push for an agenda that is out of sync with where the globe needs to go, where the world needs to go in terms of climate emissions. Russia, this is from our friends at Razom We Stand, which is the new name for the coalition that originally was We Stand with Ukraine, which 198 Methods has been a supporter of since the war began in February of 2022. And so, as they say, Russia is the world's largest exporter of gas and oil, third largest exporter of coal in the world, and revenue from fossil fuel exports is a key source of their income. Basically, fossil fuels are paying for Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. And here in America, American fossil fuels are delaying the ability of our European allies and of Ukraine to push back on and resist and put distance between themselves and Russia's autocratic government. So this is very much the second theme that we'll talk about a lot is this split that became because of the war in Ukraine in part, but also was amplified through domestic policy choices here in the US. This has really been a year of clean energy Democrats. That's small d Democrats. I'm not talking about the Democratic Party here in the US, though. On a domestic basis, yes, most Democrats are in favor of clean energy, most Republicans are opposed. But what we're really talking here is clean energy Democrats versus fossil fuel fascists. So you should think much more like Trump and Putin were a model of a leader who's primarily financed by fossil fuels, very indebted to the fossil fuel industry for their money and their wealth and their ability to maintain power, but they are using more autocratic or fascist political systems to drive their agenda forward. Standing against that, you have nations like Ukraine now is pushing to build a domestic clean energy economy. Here in the US, there are lots of people and states and politicians who are pushing forward for small d democratic, locally controlled renewable energy. And so back when the war started, we pushed and helped create one of these new campaigns. Bill McKibben was the original author of Heat Pumps for Peace and Freedom. So we took that idea and amplified it to be all kinds of renewable and clean energy tech to fight fossil fuel fascists, wind power, utility scale solar, and as well as heat pumps and other things. And the reason we mentioned this campaign as a driving force in 2022 is we did win that campaign. President Biden later in the summer did actually invoke the Defense Production Act, which is what we've been asking him to do, to dramatically accelerate domestic manufacturing of heat pumps, solar panels, and certain components that go into batteries, which can be paired either with cars or with solar panels or anything else to store electricity and build what we call the distributed grid. So if you've got a solar panel connected to a battery connected to your house, you are an independent power producer, storer, and user all in one thing. And if all of the houses in your neighborhood were like that, that would be a very safe, distributed, resilient grid. And this comes up a lot in the war in Ukraine, because right now, what Russia is doing is bombing and shelling a lot of their energy infrastructure, their power plants, their centralized heating plants, things like that. And because they don't have a distributed democratic small d energy grid, they are not able to keep the power on, keep the heat on for users all the time. And so they want to rebuild. When they rebuild from places that have been attacked by Putin's aggression, they want to rebuild a distributed small d democratic grid. And that's the same thing we've been trying to do here in the US for a long time. The other big theme we think will carry forward, of course, is US politics. And so we're talking mostly here about the Inflation Reduction Act and the long struggle. All of 2022, we were talking about various shades and flavors of this. What happened was what started out as President Biden's Build Back Better agenda, which included a bunch of stuff about clean energy and renewable energy investment, eventually was pared down. For a long time, Joe Manchin just said no, he wouldn't vote for it. He wouldn't let it move forward in the Senate. So he was just blocking all progress. And then around the middle of the summer, July, August, he came out with what we called the Manchin-Schumer compromise, and which we were skeptical about because, one, Joe Manchin agreed to it, so it couldn't be that good, right? But actually, when we got into the details, the reason why we were suspicious for it is on a climate and clean energy perspective. Remember what Joe Biden promised and what we promised to do under the Paris climate agreements, this goes back to the Obama administration, is to cut our global warming pollution 50%, roughly in half, by 2030. And what they say that the Inflation Reduction Act will do, the most optimistic projections on it, say that we'll cut global warming pollution in the US by 40% by 2030. So the first reason we were suspicious is it's not the whole thing, right? It's not the whole goal that we were promised and that we need to get to actually combat climate change at the speed and scale that we say we need to. One big victory on this is that originally when Manchin and Schumer agreed to their compromise, that included what we call the Manchin Dirty Deal, which was a separate agreement not included in the Inflation Reduction Act, because the Inflation Reduction Act is a tax bill. What it does is change the tax incentives and credits and spending things that you can get if you already buy something like a heat pump or a solar panel. But you have to go buy the thing first before you can get the tax credit for it. So it takes a little while for the Inflation Reduction Act to get into pace. And things like Biden's decision to use the Defense Production Act to scale up domestic heat pump production, solar panel production, are much quicker investments, because that's actually the federal government saying, hey, we're going to pay you to build a thing, or we're going to order you as a federal related contractor to build this thing along with other things that you build. So that stuff makes a much bigger difference, gets the clean energy going much quicker than the Inflation Reduction Act will. And to counteract that, Joe Manchin wanted to say, well, and then you have to order a bunch of fossil fuel stuff to be built as well. You have to say yes to a bunch of pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure if you're going to say yes to a bunch of clean energy infrastructure. And we defeated that proposal, the Manchin Dirty Deal, his so-called permitting reform bill. And the reason that's a big deal is that means there isn't now this sort of simultaneous big pressure to build fossil fuels and renewable energy. There is still a bunch of stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act that's not that great, including requirements to lease land offshore and onshore for fossil fuel extraction. So you got to open up, if you want to build an offshore wind turbine, for example, you have to open up a commensurate amount of space to offshore drilling in the US. And that's all written into the text of the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's still bad stuff in there, and there's still sort of these cross-cutting pressures. That's why we're suspicious about its ability to actually achieve 40% reductions in global warming pollution. But the worst possible outcome was avoided when we defeated Manchin's dirty deal, because now at least we're not mandating construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure. At the same time, we're helping to speed construction of new renewable energy infrastructure. So there is this sort of head start or extra investment in renewables. But like I said, first thing to say about the Inflation Reduction Act is it's just not the whole enchilada. Even best case scenario, it'll get us down to 31 to 44% below where we were in 2005. And the promise is to get us to 50% below. So it's about 80% of what Joe Biden promised if everything works out. And then there's a lot of stuff that we got to do. If you look, most of the graph here where the orange bars is like with the Inflation Reduction Act, that's where they're projecting somewhere in the range of those orange bars is where the impact will be. And most of that stuff happens, obviously, they passed the law in 2022, kind of late in the year. And so it won't really get going until next year. And then most of the dividends will pay out between 2023 and 2025. And then the reduction in emissions comes mostly after 2025, because you got to get the heat pump installed, right, by 2025, so that it can replace a fossil fuel source and then be reducing your emissions going forward. So the steeper curve of this is not until after 2025. So that's why we're nervous about the Inflation Reduction Act. We're hopeful. We want it to work, and we hope that it will get us at least this far, because again, that's not far enough. We're going to have to do more stuff. So let's talk about where we're at and where we need to go. And again, this is drawn from a series of reports some of our allies have done, mostly for and around the United Nations Climate Conference, which happens in late November every year. So this is the annual conference to review the goals that were set in the Paris Climate Agreement. Those are called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. You'll see that come up. And it talks about where we are so far, which is mostly not very good news, and where we are going, which is also not very good news, but where we want to go, which is what we're aiming for. So start with just the basic stuff. Where we are, fossil fuel emissions are up again. They went down a little bit. You see that little dip in all of these things. This one is by fuel source. So coal, biggest source of global warming pollution in the world, biggest fuel source pollution, went up from 2021, went up in 2022. The slight decline was generally around the world. Pandemic shut down a lot of things, and therefore we were using less fossil fuels for stuff. Notably, the dip is smallest in fossil gas, because that's used both for heating and for electricity, and people didn't necessarily in 21 than they did in other years. We were home, but we were mostly still heating our homes with this kind of stuff. Waiting for my slide to catch up. There we go. This one is nationally how much global warming pollution is coming from each country. So again, you'll see a little dip on several of them, and then globally a pretty big dip in 2021 for the pandemic, but bounced right back in 2022. Emissions are up again, in some places higher than they've ever been, globally just about as high as they've ever been. And that is, again, the result of pandemic, things opening back up, people driving more, using more electricity. The two biggest per capita changes here, it looks like China is like, oh my gosh, China's going so fast. But when you break it down by person, China is actually declining or sort of slowing just a little bit. And the US and India are actually the fastest growth per capita on this chart. So where's this leave us? Not very good is the shortest possible answer. Basically, where we're at right now is that globally, you could see that red bar there and the gray bar, those are nationally determined contributions. That's what countries have promised to do to reduce their emissions. And it is just not on track. If we do nothing, this little purple line, emissions will go up. They will peak sometime around 2030, 2040. And really, they will not come down very much after that. So we'll kind of stay level, not a huge increase like we've seen historically, but that's still a lot of pollution coming in all at once. And even if countries do everything that they promised to do, like the Inflation Reduction Act, the big thing we promised to do here in the US, it still won't even get us to the 2C, 2 degrees Celsius goal, which is the absolute maximum we're supposed to be allowed to emit under the Paris Climate Agreement. What we're supposed to be trying to do, aiming for, is to get between 1.5 and 2C of warming, and as close to 1.5 C as we can. And so, as you can see, we're nowhere near on track for that. globally. And to get there, we would need to do some really steep declines. We have to immediately, this has to be the most emissions we've ever had, has to start in 2022. This has to be the peak, and we have to immediately reduce on a really steep trajectory. And again, landing between those 2C, the red bar, and the 1.5C, the green bar, is supposed to be the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement. So somewhere in that range and as close to the 1.5C. But as you can see, that's just a really steep decline in fossil fuels and emissions as a total global budget. And then here domestically, we've shown you this before. This is actually a graph we used earlier to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. And in particular, what this is showing you is the purple bar at the top there is basically if we did nothing, which not really nothing, but if we just kept the existing policies in place. And this is from before the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And what it was looking at was the Inflation Reduction Act. If you remember that other graph we showed you earlier, looks like this. There's that blue bar, and then there's that kind of range of possibilities in the orange. So it's like if Inflation Reduction Act doesn't do very good, it would end up at the higher part, maybe 31% reduction. If the Inflation Reduction Act does really good, lots of people use it to install heat pumps and solar panels, then you'd end up lower, like at the 44%, right? So that is comparable in here to the blue bar and the green bar. So that kind of range of possibilities. And again, this bottom dark green bar here, that's what President Biden promised. So nothing is getting us there. Nothing is getting us to what President Biden promised he would do. But the Inflation Reduction Act gets us somewhere closer, and the sort of range of possibilities is in this sort of in-between spot. All right, so we've talked about some themes from 2022, and we've talked about where we're at in terms of global and domestic carbon budget for the year. And now we're going to talk about what we're doing in 2023. First thing, we got to keep taking on fossil fuel fascism head on. And obviously, the big thing that's driving this is the continuing war in Ukraine and President Putin continuing to push his fossil fueled government to use war and oppression as a way to continue to prop up their profit margins. And then here in the US, the return of Donald Trump as a presidential candidate. Trump was very much of the same mind. He pushed a lot of policies here domestically that would have made us fossil fuel fascist or fossil fuel autocrats around the world. He never went to war with anyone, as Putin has done, but he did everything else basically in terms of a policy agenda. And Joe Manchin has very much been the inheritor of that particular policy agenda. We expect in 2023, we will continue to have to challenge Joe Manchin in the Senate, work to remove him as chair of the Senate Energy Committee, and to reduce his power and his ability to force us to use fossil fuel energy instead of renewable energy. And then we have to be on guard against the return of Donald Trump and people like him who will want to retake power and reclaim power in the US to make our country work more in terms of policy, energy policy, like Russia does. To use fossil fuels and energy policy as a weapon to conquer our opponents, as opposed to a tool to build small d democracy around the world, as well as clean energy and climate goals. Second thing we'll need to do is get in the way of stuff. As we said, we won a big victory by stopping Manchin's dirty deal, which would have sort of mandated the construction of a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, most notably the Mountain Valley Pipeline. But there's still a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure getting built out there, including coal trains shipping coal to New England power plants. We've got the Line 5 pipeline that we're still fighting in the Great Lakes region, all of these different projects in the Gulf and in the Pacific Northwest. There's all this different stuff. And we have to keep getting out and blocking, delaying, and making it impossible to build that fossil fuel infrastructure, because every little bit of delay we can get right now, again, remember the Inflation Reduction Act is coming. It's going to help us build some renewable energy. Bill McKibben said this week in a piece he wrote that it's no longer a question of whether or not we'll build any renewable energy. It's a question of how fast we'll get it built and if it will be enough. And another good reason to get out there and take nonviolent direct action is every time we had a big victory this past year, it was immediately after we had a really good nonviolent direct action campaign. So if you think back, the Manchin-Schumer compromise, as flawed as it is variously, that deal only happened right after we announced plans to shut down the congressional baseball game with an action called Now or Never. When you think about defeating Manchin's dirty deal, we had a huge rally on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Early in September. We had a big lobbying campaign with lots of people involved all over the country, visiting the members of Congress, calling, emailing, writing, and all of that stuff together was how we defeated the dirty deal. And just last week, our friends at No Coal, No Gas here in New England helped shut down another shipment of coal to the last remaining coal-fired power plant without a shutdown date in New England. That's the Bow plant in Bow, New Hampshire, the Merrimack Generating Station. And so these kind of actions will continue to be essential, both because they actually make a difference, actually slow down fossil fuel growth and use, and give time for renewables to catch up and replace them. We'll talk more about that in a second. And two, because they dramatize the conflict and they give people a way to see the difference between fossil fueled fascists and small d democratic renewable energy supporters. And so people need to be able to find themselves in the fight and identify which side we're on. And nonviolent direct action is a great way to do that. Last thing we want to do in 2023 is hit the accelerator on clean energy and renewable energy growth. This is going to be complicated, and it's going to involve some new tactics that we haven't done a lot before, as well as some things we've been doing for a long time, like advocating at state utility commissions, regional, like the ISOs, regional electric utilities, and at FERC. And the blog post, there's a longer story about this. But if you want to see an example, this map is from our friends at the American Coalition for Energy Efficiency. And it's looking at state level incentives to switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy, especially for things like heat pumps. And what you'll notice is this is not evenly distributed. Most states have no incentives to switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy. That's the gray ones here. But a bunch of states actually discourage switching. And a bunch of those states are in the Southeast and the more conservative parts of the Mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, where they have strong Republican, I'm talking here about the party Republican conferences, either in their state legislatures or in their governors, and in places like Texas and Louisiana, where they have a very strong fossil fuel lobby industry that really keeps the states dependent on fossil fuels. So what does this mean? It means that we're going to see a lot of really pitched fights between local utilities, local utility regulators, and consumers who are trying to make the switch and take advantage of things like the Inflation Reduction Act to switch from fossil fuels for their heat and for their electricity and for their transportation needs over to clean energy, to things like electric cars and to heat pumps and to solar panels, but where they are actively being fought and resisted by their own governments at the state and local level. And the Inflation Reduction Act and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission are supposed to help people with that, but they're not going to be able to unless we get in and help people at the local level overturn some of these local governments that are really refusing to use the benefits and refusing to allow the transition to happen, frankly. Great example of this was in North Carolina over the holiday weekend, unfortunately. A lot of the US, especially the eastern US, was hit really hard by this big winter storm, huge blizzard in Buffalo you've probably heard about, but it was very cold and very snowy and icy in North Carolina as well. Duke Energy for years and years has resisted switching to renewable energy and distributed generation, that small d democratic energy policy that says a solar panel and a battery on every house, and then we all power ourselves and our neighbors collectively. They have really resisted that, wanting instead to keep running a huge fleet of coal-fired power plants, dirtiest fuel, remember from the global emissions by fuel source graph back there a couple slides ago. And also huge money makers for Duke Energy, because those are old coal plants. They've already paid off the investment of building the thing, and now they're just making big profits. Duke Energy also really wants to build a lot of new gas power. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and federal regulators have mostly always let Duke do what they want, which is build and rely more on fossil fuel energy and slow down the amount of transition to renewable energy. And there's a lot of folks in North Carolina who would like to build solar, would like to put solar on their roofs and on their churches and on their businesses, but aren't allowed to because Duke Energy won't let them, because Duke Energy doesn't make as much money when you put a solar panel on your roof as they do when FERC and the local utility regulators let them build a new gas-fired power plant. So over the weekend, we had this big cold snap, and just like happened in Texas in 2021, Duke Energy had to shut down a lot of their gas-fired power plants because they don't perform well in the cold. Renewable energy, the solar installations actually overperformed. They more than made up for an expected slowdown in hydropower, because of course rivers and other hydro facilities slow down when it gets very cold and rivers ice over and things like that. But solar power was more than able to make up for that gap. But Duke Energy wouldn't let people build enough solar to really build out the distributed grid. So when the gas plants went down, 500,000 customers on Christmas Eve lost power, and in many cases lost heat in North Carolina, because Duke wouldn't let the clean energy transition happen at the pace that people wanted it to. So that's an example of the kind of fight we're going to be facing a lot of in 2023, going forward to 2025, as we try and get the Inflation Reduction Act and federal incentives down to the local level so people can use them to actually build out green energy and do the fuel switching, going from a fossil fuel source to a clean energy source in the future. So that's some of our plans. I know there's a lot. We'll try and break this recording up a little bit into some pieces so it's a little easier to digest as well. But last thing before we let you go, if you're able, if you can, please consider making a year-end contribution to 198 Methods. We are entirely dependent on people like you. We don't get any funding from foundations or from corporations. And so we need you to chip in to support this work. If you want to support the fossil fuel fascist resistance campaign, we can tell you there'll be a lot of stuff happening early in January as the new Republican Congress takes control in the House of Representatives. And as we come up on the second-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. So we'll need your help right away on some of those campaigns. Looking out at the big arc of how do we make sure we get clean energy distribution to North Carolina and Texas and all the places. That's going to be a long campaign, and it will require sustained support and actions in a lot of different places. So if you're into that kind of activity, consider making a contribution of $1.98 a week. It's less than a cup of Starbucks coffee, and it will power up our efforts to hold that corporation accountable on their climate goals, as well as a lot of other corporate actors like Duke Energy and politicians like the Trump administration or the returning Trump candidacy accountable for their actions on climate change. So hope you can chip in before the end of the year and support all our work. And I hope you enjoyed our annual charts and graphs rundown. You can get the slide deck and more materials all in our blog later this afternoon. Thanks so much.